He slept with his neighbor's wife for one night. But she refused to let go. A story by Ben A. They say a secret is like palm oil, no matter how carefully you pour it, it will stain the fingers. Adigun knew this truth, but hunger had already loosened his grip on wisdom. Poverty sat on his mat like an uninvited guest that refused to rise, and every day he woke, it stretched its legs wider. He had tried everything: farm work that yielded little, labor that broke his back yet left his pockets hollow. When Alowail, his wealthy neighbor, called him aside with an offer whispered low like a forbidden prayer, Adigun's heart beat like a drum at festival time. The offer was simple: dressed in silence, tied with shame, spend one night with a bike, the fine wife who had beauty enough to command envy, but whose womb had remained silent for years. Just one night. After that, he would walk away with enough money to chase poverty out of his hut for a season. The arrangement would remain hidden between three people, sealed by darkness. Like a shadow, it will pass, Alowail promised, his eyes sharp, his voice trembling with desperation. Adigun hesitated. The thought itself was like fire touching dry leaves, dangerous, consuming. To touch another man's wife was to break the very spine of custom. But then he looked at his mud-walled hut, at the empty calabash where food should have been, at the tattered mat that mocked him with its holes. Hunger is a sly masquerade, it bends even the proudest dancer until he moves to its drum. He nodded, his voice stuck in his throat, and the pact was made. The night came heavy, wrapped in silence. The moon hid behind swollen clouds as though it too was ashamed of what was about to happen. A bike moved towards him like rainwater slipping into cracks, soft but unstoppable. Her perfume of camwood and soap clung to him, and in her eyes was a fire he had never seen in her before. She was supposed to be meek, a woman bowed by the shame of barrenness, but that night she rose with the urgency of one who had waited too long. It was not love that passed between them, not even lust in its purest form, but something raw and desperate. Like a seed pressed too hard into the soil, it carried weight far heavier than it should. When it was over, Abike lay quiet, her body still, her breath steady as though she had at last captured something she had been chasing in dreams. Adigun, on the other hand, felt his heart thunder against his ribs. It was supposed to end here. Just one night. Just one exchange. He rose, dressed, and walked into the dark, leaving behind a silence that seemed to follow him like footsteps. The next morning, life in the village moved on as though nothing had shifted. The women pounded yam at the market square, the hunters returned with antelope slung across their shoulders, children chased one another barefoot through the dust. Yet in Adigun's chest, a storm gathered. He had stepped into forbidden waters, and though his feet were dry, he could still feel the river pulling at his ankles. He told himself it was done. He told himself the money was worth the stain on his conscience. He told himself secrets, like clay pots, could be hidden in dark rooms forever. But even as he sat outside his hut, chewing roasted maize and pretending to be at ease, he saw her across the compound. Abike's eyes met his for a fleeting second. They were not the eyes of a woman returning to her husband. They were the eyes of one who had tasted something and would not spit it out. Adigun looked away quickly, his heart pounding like bata drums. He knew then, though he would not yet admit it aloud, that the one night had not ended in the dark. It had followed him into the light of day. They say a woman's heart is like a gourd left by the riverside, once it drinks water, it swells, and nothing can return it to its old shape. Abike had drunk from a river she had only tasted in secret, and she could not go back to thirst. It began with her eyes. She followed Adigun with them, even when her husband stood close. At the well, when other women bent their backs to draw water, Abike's gaze wandered across the compound until it rested on him. At first Adigun thought it was his imagination, the tricks of guilt weighing on his mind. But one evening, as he returned from the farm, he found her waiting near the narrow footpath, her wrapper clutched tightly around her waist. "I cannot sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling like leaves shaken by harmattan winds. "Since that night, I cannot return to myself." Adigun froze. The ground beneath him felt soft, as though it would give way and swallow him. "Go home," he hissed. "We said it was one night. It is finished." But her eyes burned with a hunger that silenced reason. She pressed his hand into hers, and in that brief moment, Adigun knew the chains had begun to tighten. Her visits multiplied like weeds after rain. Some nights she came weeping, saying her womb stirred like yam boiling over in the pot. Other nights she came laughing softly, promising him a future he had never dared to dream of. Adigun tried to resist, but his will was a weak broom before a flood. He pushed her away once, only for her to return the next night with her face streaked with tears. "You have opened a door," she said, her voice raw, "and doors are not so easily closed." By day, Adigun walked about like a man whose shadow was heavier than his body. He avoided the market, he avoided the laughter of the hunters, he avoided the gaze of the elders who sat beneath the great irako tree. He feared that every whisper in the wind carried his name. He feared the pounding of yam in mortars was a drumbeat announcing his shame. Secrets, he realized, were not buried things, they were restless spirits, always pushing to rise. And in the quiet of his hut, when she slipped inside like a thief of her own home, he could no longer tell if he was the captor or the captive. A bike clung to him the way smoke clings to a raffia mat, impossible to shake off without fire. Her presence became a weight he could not lift, yet a part of him, starved for affection and warmth, did not always want to lift it. That was the deeper chain, the one he forged with his own hands. Meanwhile, the village was not blind. Women at the well noticed how a bike fetched water later than usual, her eyes bright with secret joy. Men noticed how Alawale, proud husband, walked with a stiff back, unaware of the eyes that pitted him. And children, sharp-eyed like sparrows, whispered when they saw a bike's shadow where it did not belong. Adigun knew the whispers would one day turn into voices, and voices into judgment. He knew the clay pot of silence was beginning to crack. Yet when a bike pressed her face to his chest and swore she would never let him go, he felt the truth clawing at him. This one-night contract had stretched into a snare, and the more he struggled, the tighter it held. They say the wall has no mouth, but somehow it always speaks. In Yoruba land, secrets do not remain trapped between four mud walls, they creep out like smoke through the cracks and find their way into the marketplace. Adigun had hoped his sin would stay buried in the dark, but already the shadows at his door began to whisper. It was Ayamornike, the woman whose tongue was sharper than a blacksmith's chisel, who first noticed a bike's footsteps. She lived by the well, and no one passed without her eyes following. "Why is Alawale's wife fetching water at night?" she murmured one evening, her voice carrying like gossip always does. "And why does she return with a smile as if the moon itself kissed her cheek?" By the next market day, the story had grown wings. Adigun felt it before he heard it. At the farm, men's laughter suddenly grew hushed when he approached. At the market, the tomato seller did not meet his eyes. Even the children, bold as they were, giggled when his shadow fell across them. Shame is a fire that burns without smoke, he carried it everywhere, a heat no one else could see but all could feel. A bike, however, did not waver. If anything, her visits grew bolder. She knocked on his door earlier, sometimes even while the village still buzzed with life. "Let them talk," she said, her voice steady as the earth. "Their tongues cannot stop the child that is coming." But Adigun's stomach twisted like a rope. It was one thing to take money for silence, it was another to be dragged into a scandal that could strip him bare before the elders. Alawale, meanwhile, walked like a man blindfolded, proud and unsuspecting. Yet even he began to notice the shift. His wife's body softened, her face glowed in a way it had not for years. At night she turned from him with an ease that pricked his pride. He watched her more closely now, though he said nothing. A Yoruba man knows how to laugh while his eyes are counting. One evening, as the drums of a festival beat in the distance, a young boy, behind, the restless drummer, claimed he saw a bike slip into Adigun's hut. He told his friends, and his friends told their mothers, and by the time the moon climbed high, the rumor was walking barefoot through every compound. Adigun sat in his hut, his ears buzzing with the sound of whispers outside, as though the whole village had gathered at his door. The fear ate at him like termites in wood. He dreamed of Alawale discovering the truth, of the elders dragging him before the shrine, of the priest declaring him cursed. In those dreams, he was stripped of dignity, beaten by shame, left with nothing but dust. He woke sweating, his throat dry, his heart heavy. Yet when a bike came the next night, her wrapper loose, her eyes wet with longing, he opened the door again. He told himself it was only to silence her, only to beg her to stop. But his hands betrayed him. Desire and fear twisted together in him, binding him tighter than any rope. And so the shadows at his door thickened. They were no longer just whispers, they were watchers, waiting for the pot of silence to break. Adigun felt it, the weight of the whole village pressing in, the way a storm presses against a roof before tearing it away. They say no matter how tightly you hold a clay pot, once it cracks, the water will find its way out. Adigun's pot had been cracking for weeks, and now the water poured freely into the open. It was the morning of the market, when goats bleated in the distance and women's laughter rose like smoke above the stalls. Alawale, proud as ever, walked with the measured steps of a man whose name carried weight. But behind him came a bike, her wrapper tied carelessly, her face glowing with a fullness that no woman could hide. She was with child. At first, the women only stared. Then came the murmurs, soft as wind in raffia leaves. So the gods have answered Alawale after all, one said, eyes flicking toward Adigun who stood nearby, buying roasted maize. Another answered, yes, but by whose hands? Laughter, sharp and cruel, followed. Words spread like palm oil spilled on cloth, staining everything it touched. By noon, the whole market buzzed. Children sang songs that pricked like thorns, the fine wife has two husbands, one in light, one in shadow. Alawale's ears caught the rhyme, and his face stiffened. Pride is a drum that cannot be beaten too long before it bursts. He turned, his eyes searching, and they landed on Adigun. The silence that fell was heavier than thunder. Men looked away, women drew their wrappers tighter, as if bracing for rain. Adigun felt his chest hollow, his hands tremble. He wanted to vanish into the dust, but shame holds a man where even chains cannot. Alawale stepped forward. Is this true? His voice was low, dangerous, like a cutlass sliding from its sheath. A bike clutched her belly, her eyes wide, but it was not her husband she looked at, it was Adigun. That glance was enough. The market gasped as one body, the truth no longer a rumor but a fire leaping from dry grass. Adigun opened his mouth, but no words came. Guilt is a stone that sits in the throat, refusing to move. His silence was louder than confession. Alawale's hand trembled as he raised it, not toward his wife, but toward the neighbor he had once trusted. You, he spat, you who I welcomed, you who ate from my pot, you repay me with ashes. Voices rose. Some called for punishment, others begged for calm. The priest, Baba Ifayimi, was sent for, and when he arrived, his staff struck the earth. This is no longer man's matter alone, he declared. When the marriage bed is broken in secret, the land itself is stained. The gods must be appeased, or all of us will taste the bitterness. Adigun felt the world closing around him. He thought of the one night that had promised relief, the money that had seemed like salvation. Now it all lay shattered like the clay pot smashed in the middle of the market square, its pieces cutting everyone who touched them. The crowd's eyes were spears, piercing him from every side. Alawale's pride, Abike's longing, his own hunger, all of it had grown into this storm, and there was no place to hide. They say fire does not burn only the house where it starts, the smoke chokes even the neighbors. What happened in the market that day did not end in the market. It spread into every hut, every compound, every whispered conversation in the village. Adigun became a shadow of himself. Where once he moved with quiet dignity, now his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible load. Children mocked him with songs, women avoided his eyes, men shook their heads in pity or disgust. He sat outside his hut each evening, staring at the dust, his roasted maize untouched. Hunger had driven him to sin, but now shame fed on him more fiercely than hunger ever did. A bike stayed in her husband's house, her belly swelling with the seed of her betrayal. She no longer walked to the well with confidence. The other wives turned their backs, and even their laughter became knives thrown carelessly in her direction. She would sit alone, stroking her belly, whispering to the life inside. Was it guilt, she whispered, or hope? None could tell. But her eyes were the eyes of a woman caught between two worlds, the duty she could not escape and the desire she could not kill. Oluwale was the most broken of them all. A man's pride is his strongest armor, and once pierced, it leaves him naked. He stopped joining the men beneath the Irako tree. He spoke little, ate less, and at night his compound echoed with silence so deep it seemed the walls themselves mourned. He had thought wealth could solve the sorrow of barrenness. Instead, it had bought him a wound that would never heal. The priest, Baba Ifeimi, called the community to the shrine. His staff struck the ground, and he declared, when a secret festers, it poisons more than the one who keeps it. The land has heard, the gods have seen. If we do not cleanse ourselves, this shame will sit on our children like a curse. A goat was slaughtered, libations poured, prayers chanted until the air grew heavy with incense. Yet even as the rituals washed the land, the hearts of those bound in the scandal remained stained. Adigun left soon after. One morning, his hut stood empty, his mat rolled, his few belongings gone. Some said he had gone to another village, others that he had taken to the forest to seek a new life. But the elders shook their heads and said, a man running from his shadow only meets it again at sunset. Abike's child was born months later, a boy, strong and crying with the voice of one demanding space in the world. Some celebrated quietly, others turned their faces away. Oluwale took the child in his arms, but his eyes were far away, as if searching the horizon for the man who had given what he could not. He held the baby, but his grip was weak, his heart heavier than the weight of fatherhood. And so life went on, but the story remained. Mothers told it to their daughters, fathers warned their sons. The tale became a proverb, do not light a fire you cannot quench. Do not plant a seed in secret, for the harvest will feed the whole village. The market square still hummed with trade, the drums still beat at festivals, but whenever Adigun's name was mentioned, people lowered their voices. His was the story of a man who sold one night of himself and found that a single night can stretch into a lifetime of chains. Secrets, once planted, grow into forests that cannot be hidden. This tale reminds us that choices made in silence echo louder than drums in the marketplace. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself, share it so others may learn, subscribe for more African folktales, and let the wisdom of our ancestors continue to live through us.